Okay, today we're going to discuss America's shifting role in the world in the late 19th and early 20th century. The real turning point for the United States in becoming a military superpower is World War II, but this period sets the stage for this to happen. It's during the late 19th and early 20th century when the United States begins to pursue colonial territories outside of North America, enters into a major European conflict, and plays an important role in the emergence of an international organization meant to preserve peace, the League of Nations. It would be inaccurate to say the United States went from isolationist to internationalist during this period. The United States has never been isolationist. It has exerted less money and resources to international affairs at some times than others, but the United States can never be accurately referred to as isolationist. But there are limits to the government's role in the world. And so let's look at the United States at the end of the Civil War, right? Perhaps at that time, the most powerful foreign policy is the Monroe Doctrine. And so the Monroe Doctrine of 1823 defined the United States foreign policy in the Americas for the rest of the 19th century and beyond. It declared that the United States had an interest in the Western Hemisphere and that European powers must not meddle in the affairs of any developing nations there. And the policy was used to justify the sending of troops into Mexico in 1866 to intimidate the French and the purchase of Alaska in 1867. Still, even by the end of the Civil War, the United States doesn't really have the military power to back up the Monroe Doctrine. After the Civil War, of the 125 ships on the Navy's active list, only about 25 of those were actually seaworthy. And of those 25, most were sailing ships and obsolete ironclads. Right? The U.S. Army looked insignificant at this time, even when compared to nations like Bulgaria and Serbia. But if we fast forward to the end of World War I, the U.S. has annexed or acquired Hawaii, Alaska, the Philippines, the Panama Canal Zone, American Samoa, Midway Island, Wake Island, and Guam, and invaded Haiti. Right? The U.S. has the third largest navy in the world. And at the end of World War I, President Woodrow Wilson would become a leader at the peace table, setting the guidelines for an international organization meant to preserve peace. Again, the League of Nations. And so what happened? Right? First, we need to look at the connection between the rise of the United States as a global economic power and its foreign policy. In the late 19th century, we see the rise of what historians call the promotional state, a term that refers to the federal government's commitment to assisting American entrepreneurs who wish to trade and invest abroad and dedicated to making the U.S. a world power. Foreign trade figured prominently into the tremendous growth of the United States. After the Civil War, the U.S. is producing an unprecedented amount of goods in the late 19th century. And so where are corporations going to sell all these goods, right? They need foreign markets. So how does the need for foreign markets connect with foreign policy? Well, foreign commerce stimulated the building of a larger protectorate navy. It leads to Congress in 1890 to appropriate funds for 3 battleships as the first installment of a new 2-ocean navy. It leads to the professionalization of the Foreign Service. It leads to more calls for more colonies, which bring in more money and resources to the United States, and it leads to a more interventionist foreign policy. But again, economic interests alone do not explain why the United States pursues a more interventionist foreign policy in the late 19th and early 20th century. And so this might seem like a really trivial issue in foreign policy, but masculinity proved to be an important part of imperialism. Proponents of imperialism often justified military intervention as a way to prove America's masculine prowess. And opponents of imperialism were attacked as effeminate. You can see some of the legacies of this type of rhetoric even today, but in the late 19th and early 20th century, it was even more prevalent. Right? I mean, the power of calling someone effeminate only makes sense when you understand that attacks on a person's masculinity was a powerful political tool at the end of the century, at the turn of the century. Let's look at the career of one politician who would advocate for American imperialism. And when Theodore Roosevelt began his political career, he was attacked as a weakling, a Jane dandy, a punkin lily, the exquisite Mr. Roosevelt. They ridiculed his high voice, his tight pants, his fancy clothing. Some of his opponents attacked him by questioning his sexuality, referring to him as Oscar Wilde, a well-known homosexual. One opponent alleged that Roosevelt was, quote, given to sucking the knob of an ivory cane. And so to be marked as effeminate at the turn of the century could mark the end of your political career. Right? To Roosevelt, his political future depended on remaking his image as the epitome of masculinity. And when one opponent attacked his masculinity, Theodore Roosevelt marched up to him and said, quote, by God, if you try that again, I'll kick you, I'll bite you, I'll kick you in the balls, I'll do anything to you. And so TR becomes a famous politician when he reinvented himself as a symbol of masculinity. He was part of the Rough Riders at San Juan Hill in the Spanish-American War. He became an avid big game hunter. He even decided to give a speech after he was shot in the chest before going to the hospital. And so he opened his speech with, quote, friends, I shall ask you to be as quiet as possible. I don't know whether you fully understand that I have been shot. And then he said, it takes more than that to kill a bull moose. And then he went on to give a 90-minute speech after that. Theodore Roosevelt knew how to use masculinity in politics from his own experience. He, along with other supporters of America's expanded role in the world, would attack opponents of military intervention by calling them effeminate. And there is a famous story about William McKinley, the president at the time, who originally was hesitant to intervene in Cuba and initiate the Spanish-American War. And after McKinley was attacked as effeminate and weak, he was found in his office crying. Right? And just as a side note, the power of masculinity as a political tool to force male politicians to choose war over peace became an argument for increasing women's role in politics. Right? When Montana amended its constitution just before World War I to give women the right to vote, Jeannette Rankin became the first woman to serve in Congress, and she voted against U.S. intervention in World War I, stating, quote, peace is a woman's job because men have a natural fear of being classed as cowards if they oppose war. Another issue that drives imperialism is racism. Right? Remember that I said we would come back to civilization rhetoric that we talked about in the Greater Reconstruction lecture. And I had you read, I read part of a document in that lecture that called Native Americans uncivilized. Right? And so just as white Americans had justified the Indian Wars and reservation policies by suggesting that Native Americans were uncivilized, proponents of imperialism argue that the United States as a civilized country had an obligation to take control of uncivilized countries. And in doing so, the United States would be engaged in an altruistic mission because Americans would uplift those uncivilized countries. And so let's take a quick look at one of the primary documents I had you read for today that gives you a sense of this civilization rhetoric. And it's titled William McKinley on American Expansionism. And in the assigned textbook chapter, right, you read that the United States, you read about the United States acquisition of the Philippines after the Spanish-American War and the subsequent Philippine-American War when Filipinos resisted American colonialism. And so in this document, this primary source document, McKinley is trying to justify the need to send troops and resources to the Philippines to hold a colony. And I want to point out to you one essential passage here, which reads, where McKinley says that we cannot leave them to themselves. He's talking about the Philippines here. They were unfit for self-government, and they would soon have anarchy and misrule over there worse than Spain's was, and that there was nothing left for us to do but to take them all and to educate the Filipinos and uplift and civilize and Christianize them. So the idea of dividing people up into civilized and non-civilized groups and suggesting uncivilized groups aren't ready for self-rule is rooted in the racial hierarchies that we began the class talking about, right? Measuring skulls, thinking about people as distinct races, even distinct species. And the idea of civilization, of civilized and uncivilized, was perpetuated in this period in popular publications like National Geographic, which regularly portrayed different cultures as pre-modern, primitive, and exotic. The World's Fairs, which were popular at the time, did the same. Exhibits on Cubans and Mexicans, for example, would be set in primitive villages. So let's take a look at a specific example by looking at how Filipinos were portrayed as uncivilized at the 1904 World's Fair. And so the 1904 World's Fair in the United States developed a 47-acre exhibit on the Philippines. Right? The fair's organizers brought to the United States more than 1,000 Filipinos from different groups to live in the exhibit. The most popular attraction quickly became the Igaros. The reason they were so attractive was because on rare occasions, they would eat dogs as part of a ceremony. But what was a rare occurrence in the Philippines became a daily event at the World's Fair, as fair promoters knew that it would be a major attraction. One fair goer wrote to his wife, quote, "I went to the Philippine village today and saw the wild, barbaric Igaros, who eat dogs and are so vicious that they are fenced in and guarded. They are the lowest type of civilization I ever saw and thirst for blood." Right? So these types of portrayals of Filipinos as uncivilized that helps to justify the United States intervention in the Philippines. Right? And so these are some of the factors behind what historians call imperialism. To the public, it was justified by the argument that the U.S. had an obligation to bring civilization to backward places. And certainly many American foreign policymakers believed that. Right? But imperialism was also partly motivated by economic interest in the United States' need for foreign markets. And finally, opponents of imperialism could be attacked not necessarily on the merits of their argument, but as effeminate. Right? And if we fast forward to World War I, right, a different set of justifications for military intervention emerge. When Woodrow Wilson tries to sell U.S. intervention into World War I, he doesn't claim the U.S. needs to civilize Europe, for example. And so let's say if you can pick out the difference between the civilization argument and Wilson's argument. Pause the lecture and just take another look at that second primary source document, that other primary source document that we read for today, which is titled Woodrow Wilson Requests War. And so I hope when you went back and looked at that document, you saw that he paints World War I as a war for democracy, right? Which should sound familiar to you. Presidents still use this argument to justify war today, right? Yet there are still some similarities between the civilization justification and the democracy justification. These two arguments both involve the vision of the U.S. as a moral force, right, that had an obligation to improve the world in its own image. But Wilson isn't talking about saving backward peoples from themselves by teaching them how to be civilized. Wilson starts to talk about the U.S. as having an obligation to make sure that people are living free from autocracy and should have the ability to govern themselves. And so your textbook does well to cover the United States' involvement in World War I and Wilson's post-war vision. And I just want to spend a moment to talk about what the textbook fails to cover, which are the limitations of Wilson's vision of democracy and self-rule. And so in case you're interested, the story that I'm about to talk about comes from a great book called Embers of War. And so the story goes, in June of 1919, as world leaders gathered in Paris to discuss what peace would look like after World War I, a young, frail Vietnamese man presented them with a petition titled "The Demands of the Vietnamese People." He wanted to reach Woodrow Wilson, in particular, the person who wrote the 14 points, which promised self-determination for all peoples. The 14 points energized colonized people throughout the world, hoping for relief from colonial overlords. The Vietnamese petition read, quote, "All subject peoples are filled with hope by the prospect that an era of right and justice is opening to them in the struggle of civilization against barbarism." And it then listed 8 demands for the French overlords of Vietnam, including Vietnamese representation in the French parliament, freedom of the press and the right of free association in Vietnam, freedom of immigration and foreign travel, and the establishment of rule of law instead of rule by decree. And so this young gentleman rents a mourning coat in an effort to better his chances of meeting with Wilson. But like other representatives of colonial peoples who wanted to meet with the president, he never came close to Wilson. And it's unlikely that Wilson ever saw the petition. Nevertheless, it's clear that when Wilson drafted the 14 points and his message of self-determination, he never intended to challenge colonization in places like Vietnam, right? He was referring to the self-determination of Europeans. And so if the young Vietnam man didn't catch the attention of Wilson, he did catch the attention of French authorities. The French security police began tailing him around Paris. They wrote to the colonial administrator in Vietnam to get more information about him. They learned he was possibly 30 years old, had been living outside of Vietnam for several years, mostly in London, and he had a wide circle of acquaintances among the Vietnamese community in Paris. What French authorities could not have predicted in 1919 was this young, frail man would return to Vietnam and after World War II lead his people into war against 2 major Western powers, first the French and then the United States, lasting 3 decades and costing millions of lives. This young, frail man who came to Paris in 1919 with the idea that Woodrow Wilson would help Vietnam gain independence was Ho Chi Minh. So another example of the limits of Wilson's vision of the U.S. as a global force for democracy is Haiti. On July 28, 1915, U.S. Marines landed in Haiti on the orders of President Woodrow Wilson, who feared that European interests might reduce American commercial and political influence in Haiti and in the region surrounding the Panama Canal. The precipitating event was the assassination of the Haitian president, but the U.S. interests in Haiti went as far back as the previous century. President Andrew Johnson wanted to annex both Haiti and the Dominican Republic. 20 years later, Secretary of State James Blaine unsuccessfully tried to obtain a northern Haitian settlement for a nation base. And so by 1915, the Americans were also afraid that an ongoing debt Haiti was forced to pay to France tied the country too closely to its former colonizer. And Germany's growing commercial interests in Haiti were also a major concern. And so the United States gained complete control over Haitian finances and the right to intervene in Haiti whenever the U.S. government deemed necessary. The U.S. government also forced the election of a new pro-American president by the Haitian legislature in August 1915. The selection of a president that did not represent the choice of the Haitian populace increased unrest in Haiti. And following the successful manipulation of the 1915 elections, the Wilson administration attempted to strong-arm the Haitian legislature into adopting a new constitution in 1917. This constitution allowed foreign land ownership, which had been outlawed since the Haitian Revolution as a way to prevent foreign control of the country. Extremely reluctant to change the long-standing law, the Haitian legislature rejected the new constitution. Lawmakers began drafting a new anti-American constitution, but the United States forced the Haitian president to dissolve the legislature, which did not meet again until 1929. Right? The truth was that in all of Woodrow Wilson's calls for democracy and self-rule, right, he was only talking about the rights of Europeans. You can see the legacy of the civilization idea even as Wilson is changing the way American leaders justify military intervention. Right? For all of the references to self-rule in the document that we read for today, he makes one important reference that I hope you picked up. At the end of the 6th paragraph of that document, he states explicitly that he is referring to, quote, civilized states. Right, in all of Wilson's grand claims during World War I about freedom, he never called for the British to give up its control of India. He did not call for the French to give up its colonial administration in Vietnam. He did not call for European powers to give up their colonial administrations, which covered much of the African continent. And conveniently, Wilson did not mention any of the United States colonies or the invasion of Haiti. Right, and so throughout this course, we're going to dive in further into the tensions between the high ideals of American foreign policy and what it really looks like on the ground.